Hello, my name is Stephen Dunn. I'm the author and creator of Hellenistic Christendom, and I wanted to personally welcome you and thank you for attending my Soren Kierkegaard lecture series. So this will initiate my introduction to the series by looking at the life of Soren Kierkegaard. So my purposes for doing the lecture series in this kind of way, specifically with having Lecture 1 focus solely on the biographical details, is that I want to be sensitive, on the one hand, to those individuals who do kind of like the biographical context when they're approaching history or philosophy and so forth. So on the one hand, I want to be attentive and comprehensive in my approach with those kinds of individuals, but also be sensitive to those who don't really care so much for the biographical details, and hence I kind of want to make this just the one video that touches on Kierkegaard, historically, biographically, and then move on to Lecture 2 through 10, which is just going to address more conceptual Kierkegaard, philosophical, theological Kierkegaard, an example. So, now, I'd like to cover a broad biographical sketch of Kierkegaard in three major ways. The first is by way of his childhood. The second, regarding his relationship with his father, Michael Pedersen Kierkegaard, and this section will also include the, quote, great earthquake that Kierkegaard experienced in his later adult life. And then third, finally, his relationship and interrupted engagement with Regine Olsen. So, to get right into it, let's examine the basic details of Kierkegaard's coming into the world. Soren Abje Kierkegaard was born in Jutland, Denmark on May the 5th, 1813. Now, Denmark at the time was a relatively small and poor country, having a population just under about 200,000 inhabitants, and had a large community of agricultural and industrial workers. Now, Kierkegaard then was the son to Michael Pedersen Kierkegaard, he would later die in 1838, and Anne Sorenstadter Kierkegaard, who would die 4 years before him in 1834. And of course, besides their youngest son, Soren, who was the youngest by about 4 years, the Kierkegaards had 6 children, 5 of whom all died before Soren was 22 years old. He would only be survived by his older brother, Peter Christian Kierkegaard, who died in 1885, and was a prominent theologian and bishop in Denmark. Now, regarding Kierkegaard's childhood and contemporary receptions, so Kierkegaard in his youth was known for being provocative, witty, lively, and yet reclusively melancholic and solitary. Some classic anecdotes pertaining to Kierkegaard's early life pertain to his nickname as the Fork. According to his sister's account, she asked the young Kierkegaard what he would like to be when he grew up. He answered, a fork. When asked why he would like to be a fork, he responded, well, then I could spear anything I wanted to on the dinner table. But what if we came after you? His sister retorted. Then I'll spear you. Kierkegaard was also notorious with his own schoolmates, wherein one fellow classmate in 1869 recollected his schooling with Kierkegaard. He says, quote, Soren was a rather ill-tempered child. One of his classmates resented the clever, dialectical argumentation with which he triumphed over everyone, and that they therefore decided to give him a spanking. Consequently, one day, when school was over, Soren was forced up onto a table where 2 of his classmates held him up by the arms, 2 by the legs, and the rest gave his behind a vigorous working over with rulers, book straps, and etc. He thus had first-hand knowledge of what it means to take a beating. Another classmate had recollected a certain incident which is also rather memorable. He says, quote, one day one of the big boys was sitting and crying. The teacher asked what was wrong and received the answer, Soren is teasing me. But the teacher gave him scant comfort when he said, so what? You could easily put him in your pocket. Now, Kierkegaard would experience this sort of butt-end ridicule throughout the rest of his life. From early childhood regarding his outer appearance, which in his journals he recollects as causing him great sadness, up into his ridicule with the prominent Danish newspaper, the Corsair, which we'll cover in subsequent lectures to come. Now, Kierkegaard knew that he was not endowed with great strength. He was apparently refused military service at one point in his life, and even accused his father during the last year of his life in 1838 of committing the crime of contributing to the birth of SK. Now, this committing a crime wasn't so much to say that Kierkegaard was an illegitimate child. This was just more of an embittered remark from Kierkegaard, who said that at age 57, when Kierkegaard was born, his father, who was 57, was too old to bestow physical strength upon his son and was too weak to refrain from the sexual urge to procreate. So his remark about him being, his father committing a crime about him being born, more pertained to a kind of the fall sort of understanding. So, such a statement had to do with the swaying attitude Kierkegaard had towards his father in his later life, which, even though because of his father's old age, thus making Kierkegaard an old man, quote, at childhood, this allowed for Kierkegaard, so he says in his journals anyway, to really understand childhood or what he called his second childhood, through becoming a child of God. Now, more comments about SK's father will come in the preceding sections. But otherwise, Kierkegaard has availed various physical descriptions from his contemporaries that paint a rather, I guess you could say, dynamic picture of Kierkegaard. On the one hand, he is depicted as rather solitary, melancholic. He takes his strides throughout Copenhagen, only to return home to be seen in the dead of night to be completely alive in thought. In a certain sense, there's a lot of mystery as to the inner or private life of Kierkegaard, which so few contemporaries were allotted to see and experience, which there were actually even periods in Kierkegaard's life where he would refuse to speak to anyone about his writings, for example, or that he never makes personal visits, so he would say. His journals and papers have been an amazing supplement in that very kind of private area. Now, on the other hand, Kierkegaard is usually met with public derision, whether by the kinds of clothes he wore or by the kinds of women he is seen flirting with out in public, and at other times with public delight. Some contemporaries describe his demeanor as very confident and almost certain, such that there is no hesitation or rush in Kierkegaard's social character. He is constantly surrounded by laughter at public outings. He's often complimented for his welcoming temperament, nice smile, bright eyes, always a warm greeting. He takes walks all throughout Copenhagen, sometimes grabbing acquaintances and her friends close in arms to discuss all kinds of subjects, such as philosophy, German Romanticism, psychology, etc. And he is said to have done this very social activity, which corresponds to the kind of moods that his writing required. So he did this all throughout his life, and not just to be kind of pedantic and wondering, but to be very much intentional. And so I'd like to move now to a portion of Kierkegaard's childhood which needs to be mentioned regarding his understanding of himself being an exception. So, on the one hand, Kierkegaard regularly expresses a temperament which likens to the following. So, quoting from his journals, he says, "I have never had the joy of being a child. The terrible torments which I suffered disturbed the tranquility there must be in being a child, having things in one's own hands, being occupied, etc., delighting one's father, for my inner unrest meant that I was always, always outside of myself." Now, there are a myriad of factors which contribute to Kierkegaard's feeling this way. The short answer is that the kind of rigid Lutheran Christianity that Kierkegaard was brought up in as a child, which led him to further become what he called an exception. And I'd like to read this passage from Kierkegaard's journals and explain it a little bit better to see how it fits in with Kierkegaard's biographical sketch. So, to quote this in full, he says, quote, "This is to say that most people never reach faith at all. They keep living on in immediacy, and finally manage some reflection, and then they die. The exceptions begin the other way around, with the dialectical from childhood, that is, without immediacy. They begin with the dialectical instead, with reflection, and they go on living in this way year after year, and then, at a more mature age, faith's possibility presents itself to them, for faith is immediacy after reflection. Naturally, the exceptions have a very unhappy childhood and youth, for to be essentially reflective at an age which is naturally immediate is the most profound melancholy. But it has its return. Most people drift on so as never to become spirit. All the many happy years of their immediacy tends towards spiritual sluggishness, and so they never become spirit. But the unhappy childhood and youth of the exceptions are transfigured into spirit." End quote. He wrote this in 1848. Now, I won't talk too much about what it means to become spirit in Kierkegaard's language there, because that's a phrase I'll come back to later in other lectures about Kierkegaard on his doctrine of the self. However, notice how Kierkegaard's language here of exception pertains to his understanding of childhood, that childhood typically begins in what's known as immediacy, which is merely to be an existent thing in the present moment, to be held down by desires, usual cravings, and wants of a child, toys, and etc. But for Kierkegaard, the exceptions are those who, instead of having immediacy, are rather given what's known as the dialectic, which is to say that the child in question has become reflective towards others. So dialectic pertains to any two, or really however many varying viewpoints, perspectives, or positions, which are raised against one another, so to speak. So that's one kind of narrow conception of dialectic. So having such a being in the world allows for these individuals to come to a better possibility of a presentation of faith. This is how Kierkegaard understood the crux of his life with respect to his later religious vocation, seen from his writings in 1848 onward, which I'll address later. Now, moving on to Kierkegaard's university years. So as we move forward in Kierkegaard's life, I'd like to touch on his experience at the university from 1830 to 1834. Now, Kierkegaard was 17 when he first entered the university and 22 when he left. In an entry of Kierkegaard's journal in 1834, pertaining to his 22nd birthday, we first come to hear of the Great Earthquake, which provides what we can consider the definitive end of Kierkegaard's childhood, and thereby his transition into adulthood or the independence of youth towards new paths. Hence, as we are proceeding through Kierkegaard's life, there is the earlier portion of his childhood, which leads up to the Great Earthquake of SK's 22nd birthday, considerably, as I said, being the definitive break of childhood. So now the earthquake will follow from this section, thence I'll finish with analysis of the relationship between Kierkegaard and Regine. So we're almost there. So first, it should be noted that Kierkegaard was encouraged by his father to pursue a degree in theology, to which, despite the university's structure, all faculty students were actually required for their first years, until they came to what was known as their second examination, to learn liberal arts instead, to which Kierkegaard was more than excited about, and his grades excelled in not only Latin and Greek, but French, German, and Hebrew as well. Kierkegaard actually took it upon himself to take the second examination within his first year at the university, and he passed with flying colors, even showing efficiency in philosophy, physics, and mathematics. So furthermore, as Kierkegaard spent more and more time involved with his liberal arts studies and less with his theology, Kierkegaard finally became more enthralled with, quote, dramatic insight. So to borrow a quote from Walter Laurie's biography, which he wrote in 1970 on Kierkegaard, he writes, quote, "Now for the first time he was able to transcend the narrow bourgeois interest of his strange home in which there was no place for the beautiful, and while he still pursued the philosophical interests his father had encouraged, he grasped avidly after the pleasures of literature and music." Laurie goes on, quote, "There was music in his soul. He had never known it at home, and he became an opera enthusiast. He had a dramatic instinct which led him to become a habitu of the theater." If I'm saying that right, it's a French word, habitu? Anyway. "He appropriated passionately the aesthetic side of life," end quote. So such exposure to the aesthetic life would serve for Kierkegaard's overall project later in life for ultimately responding to the shortcomings of Romanticism in his own day. I'll address Romanticism in later lectures as well. Moving on to the creation of the journals. Despite the exciting and new intellectual exposure Kierkegaard was garnering at the university, it is during this 1830 to 1834 period that we see the emergence of the journals take place. Now, in the earlier portion of the 1830s, Kierkegaard starts to journal his own thoughts while his father sent him away on vacation for a little while. The journal varies in entries for the first few years, as in the beginning these scribblings are merely just jotted notes on sort of clippings of papers. But it isn't until 1837 that Kierkegaard makes a decisive and intentional direction with the use of his journals. He writes, quote, "Under the incubus of such an abstract possibility, a literary hiccup or nausea, the aroma of the thought and mood evaporated. For this reason, the entries I have so crunched together that I now no longer understand them, or that they are quite accidental, so I can see that there are commonly a lot of entries on the same day, which indicates that there has been a sort of day of reckoning, but that is crazy." Furthermore, Kierkegaard says, quote, "By more frequent entries, to let the thoughts come forth with the umbilical cord of the first mood, without any reference to their possible use, but as if I were unbosoming myself to a friend, thereby to gain first of all a possibility of knowledge of myself at a later moment, as well as pliability in writing, articulation in written expression, which I have to a certain degree in speaking. Such practice behind the scenes is certainly necessary to every man whose development is not in a way public." Now, to such an adherence, Kierkegaard remained faithful to his journals throughout the rest of his life. In fact, it was only until 1842 that he actually came to refer to his notebooks as journals. So interestingly, as Kierkegaard persisted his writings later in life, we start to see a structural arrangement of Kierkegaard's journals with the indication that he knew that they were going to be published posterior to his death. And now with this understood, in 1847, Kierkegaard began to revise his earlier journal entries and even only used abbreviations, for example, throughout the journals, which could be readily understood for readers. And interestingly, Kierkegaard remarks in one place of his journals, quote, "After my death, not only my works, but my life will be studied and studied." Now, I think it's really amazing how this suspicion actually grew later in Kierkegaard's life, especially given how correct he was after he died. Moving now to the section on Michael Kierkegaard, Kierkegaard's father. So biographies on Kierkegaard tend to highlight several popular themes within his early life, most of these pertaining to the dearing relationship Soren shared with his father, Michael, who represented a rather rigid Lutheran Christianity which was quite impressionable on Kierkegaard at a young age. So there are passages throughout his work which reflect on the impression such a relationship had on him. So for example, in one of the two ethico-religious treatises, he writes, quote, Once upon a time there was a man, and as a boy he was strictly brought up in the Christian religion. He had not heard much about that which other children commonly hear, about the little child Jesus, about the angels, and such like. On the other hand, they showed him all the more frequently the crucified, so that this picture was the only one he had, the only impression he had of the Savior. Although only a child, he was already as old as a man. There are some passages in Kierkegaard's papers, although they are told through the pseudonym Johannes Climacus, which describe in better detail his father as having an immense and vivid imagination, denying, for example, Soren the option to go outside and play, but to take a walk with him throughout the room instead. His father would greet every passerby, quote, notice the carriages which would rattle past. He would journey into Spain or beautiful seashores. As Kierkegaard wrote about these memories, he said he could go wherever he wished, for, quote, the farther they went was equal to anything. So aside from Kierkegaard's immense impact on his son's life, there's much needed attention that needs to be brought to light with respect to their relationship. So from here I'll move on to what's known as the Great Earthquake, which is said to have taken place on Kierkegaard's 22nd birthday. So to begin this section, I'll quote at length a passage from Kierkegaard's journals. Quote, "Then it was that the great earthquake occurred, the frightful upheaval which suddenly forced upon me a new infallible rule for interpreting the phenomena one and all. Then I surmised that my father's great age was not a divine blessing, but rather a curse, that the distinguished talents of our family existed only to create mutual friction. Then I felt the silence of death increasing around me, when in my father I beheld an unfortunate man who must outlive us all, a sepulchral cross upon the grave of all his own hopes. Guilt must rest upon the whole family, a divine punishment must be impending over it." Now, this passage in Kierkegaard's journals regarding a significant realization made in his life pertains to what Kierkegaard readers have understood as the Great Earthquake. To make a long story short, Michael Kierkegaard had lived a good portion of his life, or of his youth, as a peasant boy, herding sheep in Jutland, Denmark, with much reason to complain of the shortcomings in life that was handed to him. So, in fact, this very young boy, exploited such an opportunity to complain when one day Michael Kierkegaard took upon himself a hill and openly cursed God for the trouble that he had allotted him. And it was this very realization of what Kierkegaard called, quote, his father's sensuality that had led to an experience like that of a great earthquake. So it was Kierkegaard's understanding, as well as his father's, that such a memorable cursing of God would account for the various deaths he had seen throughout his family already. So Michael Kierkegaard, as well as his two remaining sons, were quite sure that they would not outlive their father and that he was doomed to experience such loss and despair. Now, while this earthquake is said to have greatly saddened and impacted Kierkegaard, it nonetheless allowed him to become a free man, so to speak. This further aroused the intellectual side of Kierkegaard's nature and the understanding that this moving forward from such a circumstance is crucial for his own moral and spiritual development. As a matter of fact, there's one, I can't remember if it's from the journals or if there was a contemporary that recollected this of a conversation that they had with Kierkegaard, but Kierkegaard was talking about how his father once told him, "It will do you much good once I am dead, or maybe you can finally make something of yourself once I am gone." And there's a sense in which this was very true once Kierkegaard came to learn of his father's what's known as sensuality, so to speak. So I'll kind of go ahead and leave this section at that, and I'll move now into Kierkegaard and Regine Olsen. So moving on then, Kierkegaard at the time when he was just a young university student, around 25 years old or so, met Regine Olsen when she was just 14 years old in May of 1837. In two journal entries, he recollects the instance of making his way to the Wardham's family's house, where Regine coincidentally happened to be as well. Now, in these two entries, she is not explicitly named, though Kierkegaard makes claims such as, quote, "The devil of banter and quibbling stay behind that spirit with who a flaming sword places himself between me and the heart of every innocent young maiden." And he speaks also of, quote, "an inclination to awaken precisely at this time," which he wrote in 1837. However, in a famous passage from his journals, he recollects his first encounter with Regina. He says, quote, "Thou queen of my heart, Regina, enfolded in the deepest recesses of my heart, in the most vital fullness of my thought, equidistant from heaven and hell, unknown divinity. Oh, can I really believe what the poets sing, that when a man sees his beloved for the first time, he believes that he has seen her long before, that all love, as all understanding, is memory, that love, also in the individual, has its prophecies, its types, its myths, its Old Testament. Everywhere, in every girl's face, I see features reminding me of your beauty, but it seems to me I would need all the girls in the world to distill, as it were, your beauty from theirs, that I would have to circumnavigate the world to find the continent I miss, yet which the deepest secret of my whole being polarically indicates." End quote. So moving forward to the summer of 1840, Kierkegaard, who's now 27, went to the Olsen's house to find Regine alone, thence proposing to her in an abrupt fashion where her only response was to show him the door. So fortunately enough, with a 2-day passing and her father's consent, Regine accepted the proposal. However, in his journal, which he wrote 8 years after the event, Kierkegaard writes that, quote, "Inwardly, the next day I saw that I had made a blunder. I suffered indescribably in that period." Now, Regine, of course, was not blind to the melancholy associated with her fiancé, and so, in 1841, Kierkegaard sent her back her ring with a note that read the following, quote, "Forget him who writes this, forgive a man who, though he may be capable of something, is not capable of making a girl happy." So Kierkegaard at this time was working on his dissertation, The Concept of Irony with Continual Reference to Socrates, and for 2 months after the breakup, he would continue to work and defend his thesis. And after a while, Kierkegaard finally meets Regine for an exchange, which he accounts as follows, quote, "I went and talked her round. She asked me, 'Will you ever marry?' And I replied, 'In about 10 years, when I have sown my wild oats. I must have a pretty young miss to rejuvenate me.' She said, 'Forgive me for what I have done to you.' I replied, 'It is rather I that should pray for your forgiveness.' She said, 'Kiss me.' That I did, but without passion. Merciful God, to get out of the situation as a scoundrel of the first water, if possible, was the only thing there was to be done in order to work her loose and get her underway for a marriage." Now, some explanation must be underway in order to understand that latter statement. To break off an engagement at this time was, in a social sense, not so good for the woman. Kierkegaard knew this, and in an attempt to save Regine, took all the blame of the engagement upon himself. As Charles Moore writes, quote, for the next several months he posed as an irresponsible philanderer, noisily showing off in public and striving to turn appearances against himself by every means in his power. Not surprisingly, he quickly aroused the indignation of public opinion and the disapproval of friends. So when the breakup took place in 1841, Kierkegaard wrote, quote, "When the bond broke, my feeling was, either you plunge into wild dissipation or into absolute religiousness, though of a different kind from that of the pastor's melange." Now, this is one of my favorite quotes from Kierkegaard because I actually read this passage for the first time shortly after my first bad breakup when I was much younger and really found inspiration from Kierkegaard regarding his split with Olsen. Now, regarding, quote, reasons for breakup, Kierkegaard doesn't seem to give her an exact reason for his breaking of the engagement, although a couple things emerge as clear. First, he felt that he was unable to marry Regine due to his rather severe melancholy, and that it was perhaps God's chastisement against him, because in 1849 he wrote, quote, "Naturally, now my melancholy is reawakened, for her giving herself means that I am again responsible in the highest possible measure, whereas her pride, to a certain extent, relieved me of responsibility. I see that a break must come. My judgment is, and my idea was, that it is God's chastisement of me." End quote. Second, he felt that due to the curse God had put on his family, he would not live much longer. He was actually a rather unfit man. As I mentioned before, he was allegedly refused by the military because of his physically unfitness, and all the while recognizing that his wits and brilliant intelligence is what kept him from being defenseless. So then, did the two ever see each other again? Well, yes, and for many years after the broken engagement was this so. In fact, in Morten Hoy Jensen's review of Joachim Garf's recent book on Regine Olsen, Joachim Garf, mind you, was sort of made famous with his 2000 biography on Kierkegaard, which was published in English in 2005, so you need to check that book out. But Jensen summarizes one of the several encounters the two lovers had. Quote, "On March 17, 1855, the 33-year-old Regine Olsen was due to leave Copenhagen for the Danish West Indies, where her husband for 8 years, Johann Frederick Schlegel, had been appointed governor. The appointment would keep the couple abroad for more than 5 years, making the toll of saying goodbye to family and friends especially great. Now, whether in spite or because of the ominous Germany ahead of her, Regine made an important decision. It seems the day of her departure, she sought out a strange man to whom she had once been engaged, a man who had left her, and to whom she had not spoken in 14 years. But if they had not spoken, Regine Olsen and Soren Kierkegaard had not exactly remained strangers either. For years they had passed each other on their walks throughout the city, often in openly calculated fashion. On Kierkegaard's 39th birthday, for instance, Regine suddenly appeared on the street in front of his home in Oosterboro. Quote, "As often happens to me of late, I can't help but smile when I see her," the melancholy Dane wrote in his journal. His smile was returned, whereupon the birthday boy removed his hat in greeting. Then, as if by agreement, the old lovers again went their separate ways. Even on one occasion in April of 1843, Kierkegaard was leaving Vorfure Church, attending a sermon by Peter Minster, which Regine had also attended. Upon seeing him, she simply nodded, and this seemed rather insightful for Kierkegaard. In a journal entry, he comments, quote, "At Vespers on Easter Sunday in Fru Kirke, during Minster's sermon, she nodded to me. I do not know if it was pleadingly or forgivingly, but in any case very affectionately. I had sat down in a place apart, but she discovered it. Would to God that she had not done so." Now, and he goes on to say, "Now a year and a half of suffering and all the enormous pains I took are wasted. She does not believe that I was a deceiver. She has faith in me. What ordeals now lie ahead of her? The next will be that I am a hypocrite. The higher we go, the more dreadful it is. That a man of my inwardness, of my religiousness, could act in such a way. And yet I can no longer live solely for her, cannot expose myself to the contempt of men in order to lose my honor. That I have done. Shall I, in sheer madness, go ahead and become a villain just to get her to believe it? Ah, what help is that? She will still believe that I was not that before." So it seems clear that Kierkegaard loved Regine Olsen very deeply and would proceed to write about her in his journals even towards the end of his life. As C. Stephen Evans writes, quote, "Kierkegaard believed that he was called by God to be an exception who must sacrifice Regine and the joys of married life. The broken engagement most certainly gave Kierkegaard the proper materials for becoming a prolific author, one that would develop in such a maturing fashion over his years as a writer." So moving forth from my section on Regine Olsen, I'd like to go ahead and move on to Kierkegaard's Death, which, rather than talk about any notes that I have written, I'm actually going to read an account by a contemporary, a friend of Kierkegaard, Emil Bossen, who first wrote this down on his visits to Kierkegaard, which I'm having the dates here as between October 14th and 16th in 1855. So Kierkegaard, as I mentioned before, was a rather frail individual. He always had apparently spinal back problems. There's one kind of funny instant where he was among friends, laying down on the couch and fell over, and Kierkegaard was insistent that nobody help him up, and he said, "No, don't touch it. We'll just wait until the morning when the maid comes to sweep." And so Kierkegaard, of course, always had this frail kind of physicality to him. He was always very kind of lighthearted about it. He said it caused him great melancholy. But there's an extent to which this kind of frail physicality came into fruition in 1855 when he suddenly collapsed on the street and he died so much later. But I like to finish Kierkegaard's Death with just this reading of an account, and I'll just kind of finish there. Emil Bossen says, "How's it going?" Kierkegaard says, "Badly. It's death. Pray for me that it comes quickly and easily. I am depressed. I have my thorn in the flesh, as did St. Paul, so I was unable to enter into ordinary relationships. I therefore concluded that it was my task to be extraordinary, which I then sought to carry out as best as I could. I was a plaything of divine governance, which cast me into play, and I was to be used. Then several years went by. Then flip, flop, and governance reached forth its hand and takes me aboard the ark. This is always the existence and the fate of a special messenger. And that was also what was wrong with my relationship to Regine. I had thought that it could be changed, but it couldn't, so I dissolved the relationship. How strange. The husband became governor. I don't like that. It would have been better if it happened quietly. It was the right thing that she got Schlegel. That had been the earlier understanding. And then I came in and disturbed things. She suffered a great deal because of me." End quote. And Bossen goes on to say, "And he spoke about her lovingly and sadly." Kierkegaard says, "I was afraid that she would become a governess. She didn't, however, but now she is governess in the West Indies." Emil Bossen says, "Have you been angry and bitter?" Kierkegaard says, "No, but sad and worried and extremely indignant. With my brother Peter. I did not receive him when he last came to me after his speech in Roskilde. He thinks that as the elder brother, he must have priority. He played schoolmaster when I was still being caned on my arse. I wrote a piece against him, very harsh, which is lying in the desk at home. Have you made any decisions about your papers? No, that will have to be as it may. It depends upon Providence, to which I submit. But in addition to this is the fact that I am financially ruined, and now I have nothing, only to pay the expenses of my burial. I began with a little, some 20-some thousand, and I saw that that amount could last for a certain amount of time, 10 to 20 years. It has now been 17 years. That was a great thing. I could have sought an appointment. As a veteran theological graduate, it would have been possible for me to obtain one, but I could not accept it. My thorn in the flesh prevented me, so the matter was decided. Suddenly, I understood it. What matters is to get as close to God as possible. There are those who have need of others, the many, all that nonsense about large numbers of people. There is someone who has need of only one. He stands highest among those who need anyone. He who needs most stands lowest. Only one person is needed to say this. Then Boston says, Miss Fibiger, had sent him flowers, which he had put away in a cabinet. It seemed that he wanted to talk with me about his strange thorn in the flesh. He says, quote, the doctors do not understand my illness. It is physical, and now they want to treat it in the usual medical fashion. It's bad. Pray for me that it'll soon be over. Another account goes on to say, now I have eaten and everything is ready to receive you, which I am now doing with open arms. I asked him if he could gather his thoughts, or if everything was confused for him. Most of the time he could think clearly. Sometimes they were a bit confused at night. Whether he could pray to God in peace. Yes, that I can do. Whether there was anything he still wanted to say. He says, quote, no, but yes, greet everyone for me. I have liked them all very much, and tell them that my life is a great suffering, unknown and explicable to other people. Everything looked like pride and vanity, but it wasn't. I am absolutely no better than other people, and I have said so, and have never said anything else. I have had my thorn in the flesh, and therefore I did not marry, and could not accept an official ecclesiastical position. I am, of course, a theological graduate. I was publicly qualified and enjoyed private favor. Of course, I could have had a position if I wanted it, but I have became the exception instead. The day went by in work and excitement, and in the evening I was put aside. That was the exception.